Hi, this is Dr. Steven Seiler. Just this last weekend, I did a 3-hour webinar with Brad and the Physical Performance Show. I was so exhausted after I had to take a 30-minute nap. But there were so many great questions that we couldn't get to. And Brad pulled me back in, and we've done a Q&A session in the form of a podcast. So tune in. And I think I even said a curse word at some point, but I tried to answer some of these questions as best I could.
Failure is not an option.
I've had my ups and my downs.
I think it's an absolutely breakthrough experience.
Welcome to the Physical Performance Show, the show designed to inspire the pursuit of your physical best performance. I'm your host, Brad Beer. Listen in as we delve into how the world's top physical performers achieve their success, as well as the highs, the lows, and the journey of getting there. Let's get ready, set, let's go. Welcome to this bonus episode of the Physical Performance Show, brought to you by the recently held Sustainable Training for Attainable Endurance Goals live stream with acclaimed sports scientist, Dr. Steven Seiler. I'm Brad Beer, sports physiotherapist and exercise scientist by trade and training, and founder of Pogo Physio. And on this bonus episode featuring Dr. Steven Seiler, get ready for a bucket load of learnings around all things endurance training. In hosting the Physical Performance Show's very first live stream event with Dr. Seiler, we were thrilled with the overwhelming response and engagement. Hundreds of attendees registered for the live stream, including coaches, endurance athletes of all abilities, health professionals, and sports and fitness professionals the world over. And since the live stream has been wrapped up, there have been numerous requests for access to the post-event recordings. And the good news is they are now available over at pogophysio.com.au/Dr. Seiler livestream for just $49, including PDF copies of Dr. Seiler's presentations from the live stream. On the day, Dr. Seiler covered 4 modules. Session 1, Essentials of Intensity Distribution for Sustainable Training and Long-Term Development. Session 2, Essentials of Interval Training for Sustainable Training and Long-Term Development. Session 3, Essentials of Periodization for Endurance Training. And Session 4, Essentials of Training Monitoring and Testing for Sustainable Training and Long-Term Development. In the 5th session, we opened up for Q&A from the live stream attendees, and the response was overwhelming, in excess of 70 very good quality questions. So we thought the questions were of such great caliber, we thought it would be a waste if we didn't bring them to light so that everyone could benefit from the learnings from some of these great questions, and that's the purpose of this bonus episode. In this Q&A, you'll hear Dr. Seiler answer questions around establishing training zones outside of a laboratory, finding maximal heart rate and heart rate peak, what role strength and conditioning plays in intensity distribution, and what metrics we may or may not wish to focus on with our endurance training. Get your pen and paper ready for a bucket load of learn-ins. Here is Q&A time with Dr. Steven Seiler. Sustainable training for attainable endurance goals. Dr. Steven Seiler, welcome back to the Physical Performance Show. You are in rare company, along with Zane Robertson, New Zealand National Marathon record holder, as a three-peat guest.
All right. Well, that sounds like almost like a sports performance. So I'm happy to be a three-peater.
Well, speaking of sports, we are fresh off the back of what was a really, I'd probably use a word, incredible live stream event. The Physical Performance Show hosted with your content as the talent, and that was the Sustainable Training for Attainable Endurance Goals 3-hour live stream, which explored 4 themes or modules: intensity distribution, interval training, periodization, and of course monitoring. And one of the legacy items was a plethora of questions, somewhere around 50 to 60 questions plus more were generated, and they're of excellent quality. So we thought we might explore some of them in a another expert edition of the Physical Performance Show, with the aim that this information can help not only the live stream attendees, but also anyone out there seeking to improve their endurance performance.
Yeah, I've looked at the questions. You sent me a screen capture of all the questions that came in during the webinar. And obviously a thoughtful group of coaches, athletes, people with some science backgrounds. So it's a good mix, and we couldn't get at everything there, but we can at least try to tidy up and cover some of that list now today.
And in grouping these great questions, there's a few themes that have emerged: finding heart rate zones without a lab, heart rate training zones, prescription of work and intensity, and then using internal versus external metrics in terms of intensity distribution. Shall we explore some of these themes? And maybe we kick off with finding zones without a lab. And Ben has asked a question: what is the best way to measure zones in swimming, or is pace the best way to go?
Well, you just started out with a hard question for me, because about the only endurance sport that I've stayed pretty clear away from is swimming. So I haven't been on this pool side very much at all. And I'm going to be careful with how to approach this. But in general, without lab, without heart rate, without lactate, and so forth, then I am going to default, whether it's swimming, cycling, running, I'm going to really default to some perceptual and physiological hacks. I don't really know how you use breathing in swimming as a self-monitoring tool. If it's, because for me, it would be a near-drowning experience no matter what. But at least on a bike or on the road, we would use a talk test as part of the low-tech toolbox to try to guide, say, are we in the low intensity? Are we where we want to be for a volume session or an extensive session? Now, for swimming, I suspect there's some relevant, version of that in terms of breathing pattern and so forth. But definitely that's one of the things I'm going to look at is, if I can't measure that, then I'm going to try to use both the comfortable duration. Normally, I would also look at heart rate drift, and then I would use some kind of information associated with breathing pattern. Because when you use a talk test, you're really investigating in a simple way the breathing issues. Because when ventilation kicks up, when you start to so-called hyperventilate a bit, that's really a result of cellular events. That's a result of that the glycolytic flux is increasing, that you're starting to get some buffering issues. So we're not doing anything magical with a talk test. We're interrogating ventilation responses in a practical way. So in the pool, we can kind of do the same thing, but then you swimmers have to understand how to translate a talk test into something related to the swimming breathing pattern, the ease of the pattern. Like, for example, Jack Daniels in running years and years ago in his running formula book, he suggested that there are specific patterns of breathing associated with the running cadence that correspond to potentially to different intensity zones, if that makes sense. That, for example, if you're running along at 180 strides per minute, if we're counting both legs, then there may be a specific pattern of how many steps you take on the breathing in, how many steps you take breathing in, how many steps you take breathing out. For example, 4-3 at really low intensity. And then as intensity increases, you'll kind of automatically step change to different patterns. Does that make sense? And I think that could be happening in swimming as well.
Like lower intensities, you're able to comfortably hold your breath for 7 consecutive strokes.
Yeah, or I don't know that they're holding their breath, but they may be breathing out over a greater number of strokes before they breathe. And
then, of course, with swimming, I imagine, Stephen, there's also, you can't necessarily see it real time, but at the end of
an interval or whatever it may be, a warm-up, you can also monitor heart rate, of course.
Yeah. You've got a bit of this natural rhythm because you're constantly turning at the pool edge or at the ends of the laps. And I don't know how much fluctuation in heart rate that generates, but I suspect you get into a nice quasi-steady state there. So heart rate should still be a useful tool. And then when I use heart rate to guide these low-intensity sessions, what I want to see is that heart rate stabilizes after, say, 15 minutes and then stays basically flat for that session. So if it's 15, if you warm up and then let's say it's a 60-minute swim, then from 15 to 60, we shouldn't see heart rate just drifting up, up, up. It should be flattening out. If it's not, then that's telling me that probably the intensity is above that first lactate turn point.
A question that often comes up, and I don't believe it was specifically asked during the Q&A of the live stream, but is the practices of endurance swimmers. There does seem to be a lot of high-intensity work done. Do you have any comments or thoughts around that? Well,
yeah, I guess it depends on who you talk to, because when I speak with some of the experts that have done research on swimming, take Inigo Mujica, it seems like there is the swimmers do follow a high volume model and do a lot of what do we call it? I use the term low intensity work, but it tends meaning below the first lactate turn point. So I guess it depends a little bit on who you talk to, what you mean by a lot of high intensity.
Yeah, it's very subjective. I think a lot of the Australian landscape of endurance swimming performance was built on lots of volume, of course, but lots of intensity in there. But as you say, lots is very subjective. Well, let's go from the pool, out of the pool. And Steve asks, in the 3-zone model, if LT1 is known from laboratory testing, is there more benefit completing zone 1 training close to the LT1 threshold?
Right. And this is where we get into this fundamental issue, which is that we have to be really careful about considering intensity in isolation, because the stimuli that we're generating with the workout is essentially always going to be a function of intensity times duration. This is where things really get interesting, because let's exemplify this with, say, cycling a 2-hour ride at 60% of VO2 max. So that's an easy ride for 2 hours, and that's talking pace for that athlete. There's no heart rate drift. Okay, so that's a situation where that power is probably not very close to their LT1. It's maybe 30, 40 watts below. All right. You might argue that for that athlete, that's a maintenance session, meaning the stimuli is going to maintain their current level of adaptation, but it's not going to contribute to extending their durability. But if they stay at that same power, let's say it's 200 watts for another hour, so they go from 2 hours to 3 hours, well, now we may see some cardiac drift. We may also see a bit of increase in perceived exertion. So now they're starting to encroach on a duration where that third hour is actually a bigger stimuli for adaptation than the second hour was. But you got to do the first and the second hour to get to the third hour. Okay. Unfortunately, we're not able to hop to the third hour directly. Some people would say, well, you can at least hop part of the way to the third hour by doing a fasting protocol, maybe, meaning that you do that ride without having eaten breakfast in the morning. So there's discussions about interaction between nutrition and the actual work and so forth. I don't want to get too far into that, but let's assume that you can't hop directly to the third hour. You got to do the first two to create the conditions in the cells for that third hour to stimulate further adaptations. Now, if we go to a fourth hour, if I keep going at 200 watts for hour number 4, well, now heart rate has drifted quite a bit. Perceived exertion has drifted a lot. Let's say it's me. Hey, I'm going to be ready to get off the bike at the end of that fourth hour. It's still the same power output that was very easy the first hour. And I was chatting away with my buddies, but now I ain't chatting so very much at all. I'm kind of getting tired of being on the bike, and this is encroaching on my durability limits. And it's a big stimuli for adaptation. However, now it's also a pretty significant stress on my body, because if I were to go in and measure blood cortisol levels, now they've spiked. I'm fairly confident that would have happened for me. And now it's gonna take me longer to recover from that 4-hour ride. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. So it's always a question of intensity times duration, and it's not the full picture to just consider how close to the threshold as a function of intensity you may be. The question is that times the duration to truly appreciate the training stimulus. And that was one of the great slides in the first session. The essentials of intensity distribution for sustainable training and long-term development was simply 3 words: intensify or extend.
Right. And so I think one of the take-home messages that I hope people get is that the toolbox for training prescription is not just intensity, it's also the duration, and manipulating those two in concert with each other. That's true for both interval sessions, but it's also true for those, you might say, so-called boring long intensity sessions, is that we're using those two hopefully in an intelligent way. A lot of training days will be more towards that maintenance side, meaning we're not trying to really push too far into that extensive limitation. But then some of our long sessions we want to make longer. We want to extend them and try to increase the stimuli, always keeping in mind that that will come at a cost. It will create some greater stress on recovery. So we're always trying to, if we go back to that term sustainability, we're trying to make sure that the stimulus is not so big that it also brings with it a big stress load that overwhelms the ability to recover and get back out there the next day.
Yeah, so great. And that sustainability was a key word that was just repeated through it. Sustainable training, build the machinery and durability over time. This is a very practical question, Stephen, but it's one that does come up regularly. You did address it on episode 172 on your first appearance as an expert edition on the show. But that is the 80-20 polarized training approach, if you like, based on minutes or sessions for the recreational runner? For example, a runner who runs 4 to 5 times per week, should they look to include 1 hard session per week or 2?
Great question. The original work that we did that kind of led to this polarized model description was based on sessions. It was based on what we would call a categorical approch. And that means that if I go out, warm up for 15, 20 minutes, then I do a 30-minute interval session, 6 times 5 minutes or whatever, and then I do a 15-minute cool down. Well, I could go in and look at my heart data, and maybe it would say that still 50, 60% of that time I was in low intensity. And then part of the time I was at moderate or threshold intensity, and maybe 15 minutes of the time I was up in zone 3. That high, or, in a 3-zone model, I was up in that high intensity. That would be one way of looking at it. But the reality is, from a physiological, biological perspective, that was a high stress stimuli for my body. I've got a big hormone response to doing those high intensity intervals. Blood lactate was high. So I'm going to just put that session in the high intensity box and note that, okay, that was a high intensity session. If it's my daughter, if it was a zone 4 session, I know she's going to need at least 48 hours to recover from that session. If it was zone 5, in other words, if she was up at really high heart rates, close to max, experience now shows us that she's going to need 3 days to recover from that session. So this is why I think that for the average person, it's useful to put these sessions in the green, yellow, or red box to help you with managing stress, because that's often what it comes down to. Back to this sustainability issue is, what is sustainable for me? Is it one of these hard sessions a week? Is it 2 a week? Or is it 2 every 10 days? Often we get constrained by a 7-day cycle. It may be that really you should think in terms of a bit longer, a 10-day cycle. That kind of frees up some space often in our heads for, to get the work that we want to do in. So I'm kind of answering a couple of questions at once here, but it's session-based, and it's because the session represents a stress response and a stimuli, but the body doesn't necessarily go in and do the same thing that your heart rate monitor does, which is attribute different zones. The body more, kind of says, was I stressed in a big way by this, or was I not? Yeah. Did I stay below the stress radar with a zone 1, where I was talking the whole way, didn't really elicit a big stress response? Well, that's going to be an easy session to recover from. I'm going to be able to go back tomorrow and do it again. Easy.
And as you just alluded to there, Stephen, there's no problems with looking at it, as I know you've adopted with your sole athlete that you coach, and that is your daughter, Serene, by looking at over a 10-day cycle as opposed to the sort of traditional 7-day cycle. Yeah,
and the 7-day cycle is obviously culturally infused on our brains and on our workloads and everything, and I get it. I mean, that's when you have time to do the long run. That's when you have time, you're not working that day. So there are reasons why the 7-day cycle dominates, but it doesn't have any magic value physiologically or biologically. And so if you can get away from it, if you can go to a different cycle, it might be 14 days, it might be 10 days, sometimes it's easier to manage and say, all right, within 10 days, I know I can handle 2 hard sessions. Okay. And that's sustainable. So I'm going to plan 10-day blocks and work around that. That's what ended up happening with my daughter, is we found out that 7 days, she was trying to squeeze too much into 7 days and wasn't getting enough recovery between those hard sessions. But when we just changed her calendar, went to 10, actually went down to 9 eventually, it allowed her to get into a sustainable rhythm. She said it started to flow. The training process started to flow for her, is what she has said to me. And that, this is something to think about. I think it's particularly if I'm talking triathlon, because then you got this issue where the triathlete feels compelled to get in a hard swim session, a hard run session, and a hard cycling session in there every week. Well, good grief, that may end up just overloading them. But if they stretch their cycle to, say, 10 days or even 14 days, then they give themselves some, let's call it breathing room, and that they can do the work, and it becomes a manageable distribution.
Yeah, that's great. That word does keep emerging, that sustainability. Yeah, and I apologize if it sounds like I'm just trying to jump on the green movement in environmental science, whatever. But it is important, because when you look at successful endurance athletes and when you talk to them, that's one of the terms that emerges is they stay healthy, they avoid injury, they do get into a sustainable rhythm, and it's not particularly sexy, it's not particularly complicated if you go in and look at their training, but what you do see is that they are getting long stretches day after day after day of actually being able to do the work. You're a physio, you know this, if we can keep them away from you, at least away from you in the sense of not having to solve a crisis, then they're generally able to get better. They're able to develop. Absolutely. And generally the longer an athlete has not had an injury or had to deal with an injury for, the more durability or robustness that exists as a buffer to develop the next injury. So, linking those uninterrupted seasons is just one of the greatest injury prevention strategies that can be. Stephen, there was a few great questions that were sent through from a performance scientist here in Australia working with the Queensland Academy of Sport in rowing and athletics, Kirsten, who has a PhD, and they're very physiology-specific questions. One of them was, how do you distinguish when an athlete needs to improve their mitochondrial content, typically achieved with the volume aspect of training in brackets, versus mitochondrial efficiency, typically achieved through high-intensity work?
Yeah, well, Kirsten, I got to say, you challenged me on this one, but I am going to push back a little bit because I even went again into the data and tried to say, I wonder what papers Kirsten is using as the seminal papers that are guiding this dichotomy that's in his or her head. Is it I'm not even sure if it's male or female. Kirsten could be both, I guess.
Kirsten's a female exercise.
Right, okay.
Yeah,
so I guess I would almost argue, based on what I could see of the data on mitochondrial efficiency, that there are studies showing increases, no change, and decreases. So I would almost argue she's overthinking it, because I cannot see in the literature enough evidence for me to make such a distinction. High intensity is a mitochondrial efficiency stimulator, low intensity is a mitochondrial volume stimulator. She knows more than I do on that topic, if that's the case. I'm just going to leave it there for right now. That we just have to come back to that question, and maybe if she hears this, she'll clarify and she'll help me see the error of my ways. But I don't see that yet in the literature, and I don't hear a discussion along those lines suggesting that we can translate available research to an informed, prescriptive policy based on that research.
And Stephen, just to put someone tuning into the landscape of those terms, mitochondrial density and efficiency, would you add anything to that? Perhaps it's the first time some people are hearing those terms.
Well, yeah, the mitochondrial volume idea is old, and it's well established that, you've got these muscle fibers, which are cells. We used to look at mitochondria as these little oval organelles that would grow in the muscle fibers, but reality probably is that it's more like a reticulum. It's, they're kind of, but the key issue is that you do see an expansion of the relative contribution of mitochondrial volume to the muscle fiber with a lot of endurance training. So that's that volume component. Now, then the question becomes, does the mitochondria itself improve its ability to generate energy for a given oxygen flux? And that's an efficiency question, is whether or not there's greater efficiency. Efficiency always is an issue of the production versus the cost. Efficiency in your car is how, your miles per liter or kilometers per liter of fuel. Well, that's conceptually what we're talking about with a mitochondrial efficiency, is whether or not the mitochondria becomes more efficient at converting fuel and oxygen to ATP. And this is tough. I mean, it's tough to measure, and there's a lot of caveats when you get into the different models that have been used to try to interrogate that. You can imagine, because now we're having to really dig into the cells. You can do isolated mitochondrial studies at rest, but that creates some issues related to the artificial nature of the preparation you're doing. Way back in the day, I even did that. I isolated mitochondria from rat muscle, and so I have a long list of crimes on my on my conscience when it comes to rats and things I've done to them. But anyway, this goes beyond what most people are interested in. But Kirsten brings up a really interesting biochemical, physiological question, but I don't think we're at the point now yet where the research in the laboratory, in the Petri dish, is translatable to prescription yet.
Stephen, changing gears slightly, there were lots of questions put forth around strength training. And Daniel, Greg, Kirsten, there were many. Kirsten and Dan and Greg in different ways were asked timetabling this or planning strength training, and where does it sit in terms of thinking around zones?
And this is one of these fundamental questions. Now, the first thing we have to think about is there is a bunch of research going on around this question of so-called concurrent training. And that goes back to the issue that you've got these muscle fibers. Essentially, we often talk about you can either train them to get stronger or you can train them to have more endurance, but you can't do both at the same time. Or if you do, you end up in a suboptimal situation in either direction. That's this idea of that concurrent training generates a competing stimuli that kind of have a tendency to cancel each other out. They conflict with each other. And so when you translate that cellular information to training prescription, then you're thinking, well, I need to have strength and I need to have endurance. How do I avoid a situation where they beat each other up, where these two stimuli cancel each other out to a certain extent? They compete with each other. Well, I think we got to rethink that. There are very few sports that are truly situations where you want to have as high an endurance and as high as a strength level as possible at the same time. That would be a true concurrent strength and endurance scenario. An example of that might well be the Nordic combined race, which is ski jumping plus skiing, cross-country skiing. And there you have truly a competitive situation where you need to have, in essence, as high a vertical jump as you can. You need to have maximum power coming off the takeoff point for the ski jump. Plus, you got to have nerves of steel, but that's another issue. And then you have to have as high a VO2 max, as high a lactate threshold as possible, because you're going to, an hour later, you're going to ski 20 kilometers or 15 kilometers, right? So that's a true concurrent training conundrum. However, for endurance athletes in general, they're not really looking to maximize their strength. They are looking to supplement their endurance with necessary strength. And when you talk, I once did a Twitter poll and asked a bunch of coaches, athletes. I said, what are the most important things that a strength coach needs to know when working with an endurance athlete? And I got some really good responses. And a lot of it revolved around this. They said, the strength coaches need to understand that we don't need to be maximally strong. We need to be sufficiently strong. And that's a big difference. Okay. So that informs programming because, again, if I'm working with my daughter, yeah, I want her to be stronger. I want her to be strong enough. But what strong enough to do what? Well, strong enough to have good posture during the stride so that doesn't break down and impair her stride length towards the end of a race, strong enough to have the appropriate foot strike pattern, strong enough to optimize stride length for a given stride frequency. So are you with me? I'm not trying to maximize her strength, because to maximize her strength would defeat some of her endurance goals, right? But to optimize her strength is a different demand, and it actually gives us more leeway in terms of programming. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I'm writing copious amounts of notes here.
Okay, so but we're not done yet. We're not done yet. So then now we got to think, because where the rubber hits the road is that for a lot of athletes, they're training pretty much every day. And they're saying, well, I'm running, I'm cycling every day, and now you want me to do some strength training too. Where do I fit it in? There's only so many days in a week. There's only so many hours, a day. And this, when you ask athletes how they are doing this in practice, there is no consensus, because often it ends up being a matter of practicality, because you do have to deal with just the reality of, well, if I'm going to train twice a day, I've got to work it around a job. I've got to think in terms of what is feasible and practical. And so, yeah, maybe there is some optimization, but I have not been able to see a clear pattern. With my daughter, just as an example, she always does strength training on easy run days, and she always does strength sessions after she's done an easy run. And she's strong, and she's getting stronger. So, she told me, she said, Papa, I'm doing 3 times 6 reps with squats at the same weight I used to do when I was dancing now. So she feels, her strength is good. She's doing these sets with 120% of body weight. So, and she's doing it after a 20K run. And she handles that, but she does not want to do that strength session on an interval day. That's her decision. Now, other athletes have said, well, I want to keep the easy days completely easy, so I go ahead and just add the strength work to an interval day. So there are different arguments, different ways of solving this. And I don't think, when you look at this in the perspective of that the strength training is supplemental, it's not the main effort, the main criteria. In general, endurance athletes will say, what does that strength coach need to know? Well, one of the things they better know is, don't make me sore, right? Because their priority is the quality of their endurance sessions. They don't want soreness to mess up their technique, and they certainly don't want soreness to defeat a high intensity, one of their planned high intensity sessions. So that's often the feedback you'll get from the athlete is, dude, don't make me sore, or or I'm out of here. Well, if they haven't been doing any strength training, there will be a brief soreness period. Yeah. But for example, research has shown, there's a study out of Australia where if you take rowers and have them do a strength session, a pretty significant strength session, because rowers often do, pretty solid strength work with squats and lunges and even power cleans and so forth. But if they are adapted to this, then they went in and tested and said, does that affect their 2,000 meter rowing time on an erg? Doing an erg 2K test. And they had them do a 2K test before the strength session and then 24 and 48 hours after on different occasions, right? No difference in their 2K time. So if they are chronically adapted to the eccentric loading, to that, then they tolerate that quite well. But if you take me, who hasn't done that kind of loading, and you throw me into the weight room and make me do 5 times 6 reps of 80% squats and that, I'll be so damn sore the next 2 days that I sure as heck wouldn't be able to do a good 2K. Does that make sense? So
Absolutely.
part of this is just an adaptation issue. If we've got endurance athletes that are chronically doing it, adding the strength training in the appropriate dosage, thinking of it as supplemental and not trying to maximize strength, then it's tolerable.
Yeah, thinking of it as supplemental, which, as you say, with endurance athletes, it is. It's about optimizing versus necessarily maximizing, and then being aware of this concept that you shared of the concurrent training concept, where there's essentially competing signals. So, and that there's no consensus on how it gets done. But I think there's some really good thinking points there.
Yeah, so this is one of those questions. I do not have the facet, the
Magic
key
formula.
I don't have it because I don't think it exists. But I do really think it's important to remember that the priority is the endurance, the strength is supplemental, and when you understand that, it maybe eases a bit of the pressure on the programming.
Yeah, and I think of something that you've shared on prior expert editions that you featured on 172 and 219, where, you mentioned that the practices of the world's elite endurance performers do scale down to recreational athletes. And observing in Ethiopia earlier in the year, the strength and conditioning training practices of, the leading endurance runners, some of the Ethiopians, they were not doing heavy resistance training. And their key caveat was, and one of the runners did say to me, dude, is this going to make me sore? That was his chief concern, because I've got to work out tomorrow. And I'm like, okay, drop that dumbbell, pick this one up instead.
Yeah. So it's that simple for most endurance athletes, because they have such a high training frequency that, you just do not want to get them into a downward spiral where they're not recovering.
And that challenged me. I thought, but in my mind, I think this is going to be helpful. But then I actually reflected and went, no, you know what? I hear you. So it's really interesting. Thanks for going there. It's a big area. If we think about another theme here, and that is, trying to find the zones. Jason asks, I've seen a lot of variations of the 5-zone system, Norwegian Olympic Federation, etc. But what are the common estimates you'd suggest using the percentage of heart rate max to delineate the zones in the absence of access to lactate testing?
Yeah, oof, man. Okay, so what do we got, an hour to do to work on this question? Yeah, it's a fundamental question. It's a great question, I think what I'm gonna do is, because I am pretty adamant about, and because I think the research does support that endurance athletes need to get their low intensity sessions right. They need to make sure that low intensity is not actually threshold. So I'm going to focus on that first lactate turn point, that transition from what is clearly a low stress, you won't elicit a big sympathetic hormone response type of session that we call, green zone, zone 1, 2 in that 5-zone model, zone 1 in that 3-zone model, versus a transition into that yellow zone where your lactate has elevated and restabilized. You're kind of in that threshold zone. So what do we do? How do we get at that? Well, the pace duration or power duration curve can inform us to a certain extent, because one thing is if you just do longer sessions, then that tends to bring intensity down. That's a very dumb answer. I get that, but it's true. If I sit on the bike for 3 hours at a steady pace, then almost by definition, if I can do it for 3 or 4 hours, it's below my threshold. And then if I add heart rate responses and get in a situation where there's very low heart rate drift or so-called decoupling, then that also helps reassure me that I'm in that physiological intensity zone where I intend to be. Make sense? Now, even there is a caveat there that, even a low intensity that is in that green zone, that is below the lactate turn point, if you do it long enough, you encroach on some other limitations like glycogen availability and so forth. And then you start to see cardiac drift, even if you're hydrating, even if you're doing everything right. But at least within the normal training window, for runners might be 90 minutes, long runs. For cyclists, it might be 3 or 4 hour long rides. This using cardiac drift, using duration, and using the talk test, I think gives a triangulation around keeping you in that green zone. Again, that talk test is just that you should be able to converse out loud while running or cycling in that or below that first lactate turn point. Okay. And that's a hack to basically interrogate what's my ventilation looking like? Am I starting to, what should we call it, overventilate or hyperventilate and so forth. So those are three approaches, using the duration, keeping the long runs long. Let's face it, that's one of the first things that happens with age groupers is they're in a hurry and they make their so-called endurance runs too short, and they often compensate with intensity. So the first fix is, look, if you're going to do a long run, make it long enough that it's actually a long run. Make it extensive. Extend. My daughter's long runs are always, I would say, 90 minutes plus, and she's just comfortable. And when if I look at her data on polar flow, which is just what happens, she happens to have a polar watch, so we use polar flow. It always calls it restitution training, which is just ridiculous because she's not recovering, she's training. But because her heart rate is in zone 1 for 90 minutes or 100 minutes or so, the polar decides, well, you're just recovering, and it makes me laugh. But no, she's not recovering, she's training. She recovers on the sofa. She runs out in the forest for 2 hours. That's not restitution. Heart rate's 125 for her. That's 65-70% of max, and she's extending. She's keeping her base and building her base, and it's talking pace. Now, a little caveat there: if you do, it's funny. As an example, she said, "Papa, I had a meeting with the club foreman, and we went out for a run together to talk about some sponsor issues, blah, blah, blah." She said, we talked the whole time, and my heart rate was a little higher than normal. The pace was a little higher than normal. Well, talking itself will tend to elevate your heart rate a bit. So got to keep that in mind, is if you're talking while running at a pace that's pretty close to your threshold, then it may push that heart rate up, just the talking process, okay? Because you kind of change your breathing pattern and so forth. But so the talk test versus talking all the time may actually create a little bit of a bump in your heart rate at the same power or pace. Now that was a lot of information, but if we summarize, duration itself is a way to help control intensity. The heart rate drift is a way to check whether or not you're really at the intensity you think, because heart rate should not be drifting very much from 15 minutes. Give yourself 15, 20 minutes to get clearly, at your core temperature and so forth, because heart rate's sensitive to that. But once you get there, then you shouldn't see a continuous drift. And then the third issue is that talk test type approach. So those are three non-laboratory hacks that you can use to kind of guide you and make sure that the low intensity is low. If we go, I don't know if we want to keep going on the other zones, but if you go to that second turn point or maximum lactate steady state or whatever, that's tricky. You're never going to satisfy everybody because it's individual, but I have tended to use a 60-minute test. Just in cycling, I've just said, do the hour of power, the so-called functional threshold power test, but don't use the short versions. Go ahead and do 60 minutes. Because that, and then you can call it what you want, but you will at least know that 60, that is a 60-minute reference that I have, whether it's a 60-minute run or a 60-minute ride. It gives me a reference pace or power that is going to be pretty close to second turn point, maximum lactate steady state. It won't necessarily be perfect, but it'll be pretty close if you're well trained. Now, and the well-trained caveat is just because if you try to do a 60-minute power test and you're not well-trained, then probably it overwhelms you. You're just not fit enough to hold that second turn point power that long. But if you're reasonably well-trained, you generally will be. But it won't be easy, but you can do it.
And we're talking about this theme of finding zones without laboratory testing, real world practical applications. One of the notes I just wrote down that was a really nice takeaway from my own learnings, Stephen, from the live stream, was that they're not junk miles as a training stimulus. It's part of the zone 1 aerobic conditioning. There's nothing junk about them. I thought of that when you said that Serene's Polar Watch was was stating what it was stating, and she's out there actually doing the minutes, accruing the minutes.
Oh, yeah. Well, you got to remember that whether it's a Garmin or a Polar or whatever you're using, there are some algorithms that are infused into the program coding that are spitting back some terms like restitution or, sufficient load or not sufficient. Like another one that's funny, if I use Polar and I do a all-out 6-minute test or a brief interval session, it may conclude that I didn't train very hard that day because the time in zone will not give me very many minutes at high intensity, but I may have been way above maximum, way above the power eliciting maximum heart rate for periods of time. It may have been super high blood lactate, but when the algorithm counts the number of minutes that I was at some heart rate above the cutoff, it's not that many, and it says, moderate training load. Screw you, that's not moderate. My butt has been kicked by this session. So sorry for my French, but so we have to realize that all of these, whichever of these tools you're using like Garmin or Polar, whatever, they're based on some algorithms that are not accounting necessarily for the physiological realities.
You're listening to Dr. Steven Seiler, acclaimed sports scientist, on this, a bonus episode of the Physica Performance Show. If you missed Dr. Seiler's live stream event, then the good news is the complete video library, along with PDF copies of the presentations, are available now for purchase and access over at pogophysio.com.au/Dr. Seiler livestream. For just $49, you will benefit from the many, many learn-ins on what is critical and essential endurance training information. Jump over to pogophysio.com.au/Dr. Seiler livestream. For now, let's jump back with Dr. Seiler himself on this bonus episode, Sustainable Training for Attainable Endurance Goals Q&A.
And that's probably a nice little segue into a few questions that came through around monitoring training intensity and distribution. And one was very practically, and certainly feel free to share around, I know you're doing some beta testing with some monitoring software in Jura, but a live stream attendee did ask what are Steven's thoughts around training peaks, metrics, training TSS, acute training load, chronic training load form, etc. Are you at liberty to share that? I know you're also doing some work on some monitoring software.
Yeah, and Training Peaks, I use Training Peaks, the calendar function, so I get an overall picture of, how many hours a week I'm training. But to be perfectly honest with you, I don't use any of the other load information because for me, it doesn't, I can game those. You quickly run into some problems. Let me give you an example. TSS, the training stress score, is based on taking the average power you're at relative to your FTP, and I believe it's squared. So you basically create this S curve where powers above FTP are multiplied and powers below FTP are divided. So like FTP is 1.0. If you're at 80% of that, it would be 0.8 times 0.8. So you get a 0.64 weighting factor, and then that's multiplied times duration. If you do intensity above FTP, you might be 1.1 times 1.1. You get a multiplier times duration. So intensity is factored in, but then duration is assumed to be just a linear factor, meaning the first hour at 70% of FTP is the same stimulus and the same load and the same stress as the second hour, as the third hour. You get my point, right? Let's face it, we know that's not true. Physiologically, biologically, it's not true because you're not in a steady state. You're in a there is a degradation. We know that work efficiency gets worse. We know that VO2 max essentially goes down. We know that glycogen becomes depleted. We know that there are numerous physiological decay mechanisms that are happening even at low intensity that will tell us that the fourth hour of a 4-hour ride at a steady power is different. It's not the same stress. It's not the same load on the body as that first hour was. But the TSS cannot account for that.
Yeah. So trusting, not trusting, but I guess you could say putting too much trust in some of these algorithms can have their flaws because it's not accounting for all factors. Yeah,
I know Dirk Friel, and I know, these guys, these are good guys, and they're doing the best they can. They're creating tools to help people. And TSS or any Carl Foster's training load, where you take session RPE times minutes, over the big spectrum, they work. They do inform and say, yeah, you're training more or less. And training more tends to be associated with an improvement in capacity. So TSS will track reasonably well across a broad range with performance. But and so will session load from the Foster system, which is maybe even more simple. You're just saying, how hard did that feel? How many minutes was it? And you multiply those two. And that also works. However, when you start to dig into the details, for example, 3 different interval sessions with different intensities and different durations, you get load values that are artificially inflated by the duration, for example. That's a problem with session load in the Foster methodology. In the case of the TSS, you get probably an underestimation of the load or stress associated with the duration of long sessions because it has a flat multiplier for duration when probably there's a certain degree of exponentiality there as well. So every algorithm has its basic conceptualization of the process, and it has its strengths and weaknesses. I'm not saying throw those away. I'm just saying, look, you better be also using your brain. Make sure your brain is engaged and you're not blindly looking at these numbers and trying, because very quickly what ends up happening is you train to these numbers. You train to the metrics. Oh, good grief, I didn't get my TSS load for this week. I've got to, well, that's a dangerous habit to fall into.
Use your brain. Keep it engaged.
And I'm not saying that facetiously. I'm saying that in a real way, in the sense that use perception, use how you feel, listen, turn on the brain in the sense that you're scanning your own body. You're doing that internal evaluation to say, how am I feeling today? It says I only did, 150 or 200 stress score yesterday, but to be honest, I'm pretty sore that, because I was doing repeated sprints, and that knocked me out. So, just put it into a perspective. And I, years ago, I was working with speed skaters from Holland, and I would sometimes join them at camps and join them for breakfast. And some of them had a bit longer hair and stuff. So I developed a very sophisticated training monitoring test, and that was the hair in the yogurt test. Which basically said that if their heads were dipping down, they were tired at the breakfast table, they weren't making jokes, then they're probably tired, and we need to think about how much they're gonna train that day. Their hair was falling into their yogurt, versus if they were cutting up, making jokes, making fun of each other, smiling, then they're good to go. And I don't care how many TSS they accumulated the day before. I'm going to look at that. So that was my hair in the yogurt test. And I'm making a bit of fun, but that still matters, because that's the canary in the coal mine. It's still, you still got to be listening to your body.
Yeah. Wow. That's
the psychological stuff will often be that'll be the first indicator that very enthusiastic athlete that's always ready to train suddenly is tired and cranky.
Gosh, so much there. And I've written down there, avoid simply training to metrics almost blindly, exclusively, and don't forget to monitor be aware of the psychological gauge, and perhaps adopt the Dr. Steven Seiler hair in the yogurt test. Keep it simple.
Yeah, but as you get older and you lose hair, you may have to adjust the metric. But most of us don't have that hairstyle anymore. But the point is the same.
Yeah.
And I'm a little bit tongue in cheek here, but the reality is there also is good research that demonstrates that if we use, for example, hormone analysis, heart rate variability, some of these other more quantitative tools, they will also register a change, but often they will register it later. Because they trigger after the fact, after the stress response is already kicked in, whereas the first indicator is often the psychometrics.
Yeah.
Make sense?
Yeah,
and that's been shown to still be the case, despite our best efforts to develop very nice quantitative metrics of stress and so forth. The qualitative are still, or the semi-qualitative, where you turn psychology into some kind of a psychometric, a number, a how do you feel number, that often works pretty well.
Yeah, gosh. And this is the concept of internal cost and relative to the external work. And we're on this theme of monitoring endurance training, intensity. And you did reveal the Dr. Steven Seiler endurance training trinity throughout the live stream. And I think it feeds into a lot of the questions that were put forwards around how to monitor the intensity. Do they use, do athletes use internal gauges such as pace, or external metrics such as heart rate? So would you summarize, this training trinity, if you like, the monitoring trinity?
Well, the basic summary is that we do have good tools for external load monitoring these days with GPS and with power measurements and so forth. We can get reasonably good data there, and I can appreciate the allure of that data. I measure it myself. I love my power data from Zwift and it populates my Endura program that we've developed. But it's not enough, because power pace is the consequence of physiological limitations. So I basically am just trying to be a advocate for a balanced approach. Yes, measure power. Yes, measure pace on some workouts. And in general, have a kind of be tuned in to that, but connect it to the internal cost using the other tools we have available to us out in the field, and that is heart rate and perception. Our brain is an amazing integrator of information, both acutely and chronically. Use it. And then we're getting over into these perceived exertion, perceived stress values. They are relevant. They are repeatable. They're individual, but they are definitely part of the toolbox. Heart rate is part of the toolbox. So that's the trinity. You've got some field measurements of physiology like heart rate, occasionally blood lactate if you can do it. You've got some perceptual measurements that you can be tuned into every day, and you've got your pace power external load data. And when you put those three together, they function as a checks and balances system. They supplement the weaknesses of each other, and that is a good triangulation approach. It's literally a triangulation.
Checks and balances, and that really jumped out to me as well.
Yeah, and I've again tongue in cheek said it's also supposed to work in government. You have the judicial, the legislative, and the executive branches of government in democratic governments, and they're supposed to balance each other. That's the balance of power process. And when they get out of balance, that's when things go crappy. And this is same with this. I think there is something about triangulation that just it works. even if you build a stool, what's the minimum? You need 3 points and if you have 3 legs, you can create a stable platform.
Yeah, 3-strand cord is not easily broken, right? Ancient wisdom.
Yeah, and I'm getting pretty ancient, so I guess that's why.
Stephen, just exploring a few final questions here. One of the great modules was all around interval training, and it was Dr. Steven Seiler's HIIT prescription for dummies. And the concept of VO2 max, was spoken about in the context of various studies, etc. A question came through from Paul, and I think it's a nice unpacking of this. Paul asks, did I understand it right? Will VO2 max, with other things being equal, age, etc., increase simply as a result of increasing low intensity volume? So I know this is not relating to high intensity training, but it's a question that is, I guess, relating to VO2 max and its its ability to be influenced.
Yeah. Well, this gets to the heart of some misconceptions that have been developed over time, and one of them is that you might say that low-intensity training only has impact on peripheral adaptations. High-intensity training only has an impact on central or cardiovascular adaptations, and you got this kind of a dichotomous approach. Well, that's just wrong. And it's understandable, but it's wrong for different reasons. But obviously, when I go out for a 2-hour run, I am increasing venous return to the heart. I am creating a stroke volume load on the heart. I am creating changes in arterial pressure. So it's not a dichotomy. There is overlapping of adaptation. That we know. And the data from at least case data where we've been able to follow elite performers over time, and we happen to have some good data from Norway on that, where we actually have their VO2 max, we have their training volumes year on year. The data is consistent with that, at least to a certain extent. Yes, an increase in volume is associated with an increase in maximal capacity. Now, you can argue that the volume is facilitating better quality of the high intensity sessions, and that's why VO2 max is improving. But at least in these case studies, the amount of high intensity training is not increasing, but the amount of total volume is. That low intensity is what is increasing, and that is occurring concurrently with an increase in VO2 max. We've seen this historically from rowing data. We've seen this historically from running data, from cross-country skiers. So I am willing to say that, yes, to a certain extent, volume also is associated with an increase in VO2 max. Now, that doesn't go up into heaven. It's not there is a diminishing return aspect here, yeah. But up to a significant volume that does seem to be associated with an increase in not only in duration, not only durability and low intensity adaptations, but also central adaptations in VO2 max.
Yeah, so that's a great debunking of a commonly held, I guess, mistaken belief around how to, influence the VO2 max of an endurance athlete. A theme that did come up at times was the concept of any validity to Maffetone's max aerobic heart rate prediction with regards to identifying zones.
Yeah, and I've got to be honest. It just shows that I don't pay attention to everything. I didn't even know who Phil Maffetone was before maybe a year ago or 18 months ago. So I can't really say that I have followed Maffetone, but I have managed to understand the Maffetone method and the 180 minus age formula for the low intensity kind of cutoff that he has advocated, and I guess it falls back into that it's the same problem as you get if you try to use 220 minus age or some kind of formula for predicting maximum heart rate, and that is that there's such a great deal of individual variation in the actual maximum heart rate, and by extension, there will then be variation in the 180 minus age formula. You also have to remember that resting heart rate varies considerably. So what really, if you wanted to really calibrate, if I know my maximum heart rate and my resting heart rate, and they're both plus minus a few beats every day, but you get a reasonable range. Like let's say my daughter, it's 187 and 37 happens to be, so that's 150 beat heart rate reserve is what we call that. That's the number of beats you actually have to work with. Well, then you can take a percentage of that and then tack it back onto your resting heart rate, and you start to get at least a little bit more calibrated measure of what is likely pretty close to your actual heart rate at, say, 60% of VO2 max. Now, I just threw a lot of math at you just then, but did that make any sense? The Moffatone formula is a generalized formula. He's basically, instead of saying 220 minus age, he's cut 40 beats out, made it 180 minus age, which should bring you down into some lower intensity, but it will have the same problems that the max prediction will be, and that is individual variation.
And you did reference that throughout the live stream, in that there's a difference between heart rate max as a generalization to, its applicability there, and heart rate peak.
Oh yeah, it's
a difference
sport
there,
specific.
Individual nature of it. There can be such fundamental prescription errors made if heart rate max / heart rate peak isn't determined accurately for an athlete.
Yeah, I made a little video. It's on YouTube. I have this kind of YouTube channel about this issue of using regression formulas to estimate heart rate max. And at the extremes, you can get, say, in a group of 10 45-year-olds, you can get a 40 beat difference in their maximum heart rate within 10. I show that in a set of data with 157 athletes that have all been through the same testing, and they're all between, 28 and 48 or something like that. And just huge variation in heart rate. Now, the regression line looks pretty typical for that data, but the variation around it can be as much as 40 beats within the same group of, 10 45-year-olds that vary by 40 beats in their maximum heart rate. That's a lot.
Yeah, that's extraordinary. And that's a great video. I have viewed that one on your YouTube channel, and we'll link that up in the show notes. And be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel. It's there's some terrific content that goes up there. Dr. Steven Seiler, it was a 3-hour live stream. This is a circa 60-minute Q&A exploration, and we could probably do another 3 hours exploring in totality the rest of the questions. There's so much interest around this. There's so much that you can share. But is there anything else that, we both looked at the lists there of questions that you feel would be useful to comment on?
Well, I'm going to go back to one question. It's just because I was having a great conversation with one of my colleagues last night about middle distance athletes. And there were just questions about the training of the so-called middle distance athlete. And let's define middle distance as, in running, it's often the 800, 1500 meter, that a little bit under 2 to 4 minute duration, which is it is in the middle physiologically, where you've got a aerobic component, but you've also got a big anaerobic component to the performance. And so a lot of questions have emerged about, well, do these athletes should they train, in quotes, polarized? Should they be doing a lot of low intensity volume and then some high intensity work and so forth? And, there's not a tremendous amount of intervention-based research there, but there are case studies, and we have gone in very carefully and looked at 30, 40 years worth of the best 800 meter and 1500 meter runners in history, and tried to look at get access to their actual training, their coaching, and so forth. And what emerges is, the first thing is that you really shouldn't group 800 meter and 1500 meter together, at least not at the highest levels of performance. They are different animals. The true 800 meter world-class specialists are not world-class in the 400 meter, and they're not world-class in the 1500 meter. Now, there are a couple of exceptions like Sebastian Coe, but there are very few. And the 1500 meter specialists are also good in the 5,000, 10,000. So what you end up seeing is that the 1500 meter, the athletes that are competing over a 3.5, 4 minute duration, they are essentially training very much like the distance athletes. A lot of green volume or low intensity volume, kind of pyramidal or polarized, and so forth. But then, and 80-20, pretty, it fits pretty well with that group. When you go to the 800 meter, when you go one step down in duration to 2 minutes, 1:45, and so forth, then what we see is those athletes are more around 65, 70, 30, 65, 35 in intensity distribution. They are still training polarized in the sense that their easy jogs are easy, but they're not very long. They may be 30 minutes. They're not doing 2-hour runs, whereas the 1500 meter specialists will be. So the kilometer counts are much lower for the 800 meter specialists, whereas the 1500 meter specialists will be more like, they won't be doing 200K a week like a marathoner, but they'll be doing 130, 40, even 50. Whereas the 800 meter runners will be doing 70 to 100 kilometers a week. So they'll be at a much lower volume. So that's kind of interesting, I think. And it really does show that the middle distance is kind of a great divide, and it literally divides at that junction between 2 and 4 minutes, it seems.
Yeah, so interesting. And then obviously, you break down in one of the modules there the 3 competition types that we train for beyond middle distance, which is that 6 to 60 minute range, the 2 hour to 10 hour body management challenge range, and the 60 minute to 6 hour wars of attrition. So it's nice just to finish our time on this Q&A around some of that, as you say, 2 to 4 minute duration racing or competition time. And one of your students, as you mentioned, PhD scholars there, is doing a review at the moment. So when might we see some of that come to light?
We're 4 different people, Thomas Haugen, Even Sonbach, Espen Tønnesen, and myself working on this. And this is we're really trying to integrate the physiology with the practice and see where the rubber hits the road. He says he'll have the manuscript. We're in this process next week. I'm supposed to get the next iteration. So we're hoping to have this sent to the reviewers in the next couple of weeks. We've done this for sprint, and now we're doing it for middle distance. I've done some work, and others have done on endurance. So we're kind of trying to extend ourselves and use our different expertise together. Thomas Haugen's a great sprint. He's an expert on sprint. Even Sonbach and Espen Tønnesen have been looking at training intensity distribution for years. I have too. So it's a good team. And we've even, in the spoiler alert, is we're hoping to have one of the people that is looking at the manuscript is actually none other than Vebjørn Rodal, who ran 142.58, I believe it was, 142.57, gold medal in 1996. He's still coaching. And so he has that manuscript, and he's looking at it with his eyes as a former world-class performer in the 800 meter to help inform the manuscript.
Wow, that adds an extra level of credibility, and also translating research into practice, I guess.
Yeah, and that's kind of where we want to be, is we want to do good research, but we also want it to inform practice and meet the tough criteria of both the scientists, but also coaches and athletes.
And Dr. Steven Seiler, thank you for the contribution you continue to make in the science world, which does inform so much in the way of coaches, athletes, practitioners, in their practices in working with endurance athletes. And it sounds like an unashamed plug, but this really is. There has been such interest and ongoing discussion and engagement around the Sustainable Training for Attainable Endurance Goals live stream. So if you happen to miss that, this has piqued your interest. It is well worth the relatively small investment of $49 Australian to pick up all the material and also the PDFs that accompany the excellent 4 modules that you presented. So Dr. Steven Seiler, thanks once again for the work you do and your contribution.
Well, thank you. And, this was one of these lemonade from lemons situations. We were supposed to do a live event on the Gold Coast. The COVID-19 pandemic has made us, physically distanced, but it's also allowed us to rethink how we deliver content, how we make it accessible. And I appreciate you swinging around, turning a bad situation into hopefully a good one by making that webinar possible.
Thank you, Dr. Seiler. Let's all keep making lemonade from lemons.
All right. Take care.
So there you have it. So many learnings. And I trust and I know, as per usual, you took a lot away from Dr. Seiler's share-ins. If you did, then please reach out and let Dr. Seiler know. You'll find Stephen easily over on You'll find Dr. Seiler easily over on Twitter at Steven Seiler, STEPHENSEILER. And if you enjoyed the Q&A, then you'll most certainly benefit and enjoy the live stream available now with post-event video recording access. It's simple. Jump over to pogophysio.com.au/Dr. Seiler livestream. For now, stay tuned for more upcoming learnings from the Physical Performance Show. Until then, keep pursuing your physical best performance. I'm Brad Beer, and this has been the Physical Performance Show.